Okay, so you've given us a really interesting bunch of stuff on benchmark testing. Seems like you want to really get down to the nuts and bolts of it, what it is, why it matters. So, should we just jump right in?
That's good to me.
Yeah. Cool. So basically, from what I'm seeing in your sources, benchmark testing is all about getting these repeatable results, quantifiable results, I guess. Like you're taking measurements to see how a product or a service stacks up against some kind of standard. And this isn't just for software, is it?
No, 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 it's definitely not limited to software.
Right.
You see it in hardware too,
Yeah.
and even like broader business stuff.
Yeah. Makes sense. So the football team analogy from your materials, where they talk about benchmarks for Premier League players, like goals scored, ball possession, all that. That kind of drives the point home, I think. Like you're setting a bar for excellence, and it's got to be measurable.
Right. Exactly. You need that yardstick to see where things stand. And the cool thing is, it's not just a snapshot in time. It's like you can use it to track progress too. How do new versions or completely new products measure up to the benchmarks you set?
Yeah.
So it's a way to evaluate the present and guide the future.
Totally. So for this deep dive, I'm thinking we break down the essentials from all the stuff you've given us, make it fun, and most importantly, make sure you walk away with a solid grasp of what benchmark testing is all about, without feeling like you just got hit by a textbook?
Yeah, for sure. We'll keep it clear and engaging.
Yeah.
So I guess the first thing we should really nail down is what exactly is benchmark testing? We've kind of touched on it already, but I think it boils down to the fact that the results you get, they got to be repeatable, and they got to be something you can actually measure and use to compare things. And that's where those two key characteristics come in, right?
Yeah.
Repeatability,
Mm.
quantifiability.
Yeah, those words. So repeatability means if you run the same test a bunch of times under the same conditions, you should basically be getting the same results, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're doing a load test, the response time shouldn't be totally different each time.
Exactly. If those response times are all over the place each time you run the test, it makes it really hard to trust the results. You need that stable response.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, you have quantifiability. That's about focusing on stuff you can actually measure, like how long it takes for a web page to load, not something fuzzy like how much a user likes the look and feel of a site,
Mm-hmm.
which, I mean, that's important, but it's not something you can easily measure in the same way, right?
Right.
Benchmark testing is all about the concrete stuff,
Yeah.
the numbers.
Right. And it's important to remember, and this comes up a few times in your materials, that benchmark testing isn't just a software thing. We're talking about evaluating hardware performance too, like how fast a processor is or how quickly it can access memory. And in the business world, you could be benchmarking things like how much it costs to acquire a new customer or how your sales figures stack up against the industry average. But it seems like the tutorial you gave us is mostly focused on web applications, which makes sense, right? Like the internet is such a big part of our lives.
Absolutely. And when it comes to web applications, the benchmarks can cover a huge range of stuff. Your sources talk about things like browser compatibility, making sure the website works properly in different browsers. That's huge, right? Because
Yeah.
you want as many people as possible to be able to use the site without any issues. Then there's checking for broken links, making sure the HTML code follows the rules, and of course, load time, how fast those pages pop up for the user. That can make or break a site. And then there are things like accessibility, which is about making the site usable for people with disabilities, and even things like how many other sites link back to yours, which matters for SEO. All of that can be benchmarked.
Yeah. So it's like a full checkup for your website.
Yeah.
And okay, so why is all this benchmark testing so important, especially for businesses? Like what makes it more than just some techie exercise?
Oh, it goes way beyond just the technical stuff. Like on a business level, it can give you some really crucial insights. For example, you can directly compare how well your web application is doing compared to your competitors. Are your pages taking forever to load? Are customers getting frustrated with downtime? Benchmarking gives you the data to answer those questions.
Yeah. It's about knowing where you stand in the market. And also, it helps you understand how people are actually experiencing your site, right? Like how response times might be different for people in different parts of the world or with different internet speeds.
Exactly. It gives you a much clearer picture of the user experience. And it's also about making sure you're following the rules. There are standards and best practices for websites, security, accessibility, the quality of the code, all that. Benchmark testing can help you make sure you're ticking all those boxes.
Right. And I bet it's also super useful when you're thinking about hiring some outside company to handle some part of your business. Like you'd want to benchmark their performance before you sign on the dotted line, right? Just to make sure they can actually do what they say they can do.
Exactly.
Hmm?
It helps reduce the risk when you're making those kinds of decisions. And finally, benchmark testing can really highlight where you might be messing up, where your application is lagging behind or where you're not following best practices. It's a great tool for continuous improvement.
Okay. So the why is clear. Now let's talk about the how. Like, how do you actually go about setting up these benchmark tests? Your sources talk about putting together a benchmark test plan. What are the key steps involved there?
Yeah, the test plan is super important. It's like your roadmap. The first step is figuring out how you're going to simulate the load on the system, the amount of traffic you expect or the specific conditions you want to test. And you need to make sure it's realistic, right? Like, are you
Okay.
simulating a sudden spike in users all logging in at once? Or a steady stream of transactions happening throughout the day? You got to get that right.
Right. It's like creating a mini version of the real world for your application to live in during the test.
Exactly. And once you've got that figured out, you need a good system for collecting all the data from the tests, response times, error rates, all the metrics that matter to you. And you need to store that data securely.
Makes sense. You can't improve what you don't measure, right? Accurate data is everything. What else goes into the planning stage?
So you need to be clear about how long the test is going to run and what will signal that it's done. You also need to have a backup plan in case things go sideways during the test. Like, what happens if something crashes? How do you get back on track? And finally, you need to decide who has the power to stop the test if things get really out of hand. So a solid test plan isn't just about the technical stuff. It's about managing the whole process from start to finish.
So it's about the big picture, not just the nuts and bolts of the test itself. Now, your sources also break down how you actually conduct these tests into 4 different phases. Want to walk through those?
Sure. So first up is the planning phase. Here you're figuring out what standards and requirements you're going to benchmark against. You're getting specific about what you're going to measure. And you're outlining the entire testing process from beginning to end.
Okay, so this is like laying the groundwork, making sure everyone's on the same page.
Right. They move into the analysis phase. This is where you really dig into the data you've collected. You want to understand why things are happening the way they are. Like, if you're seeing errors, what's causing them? The goal here is to figure out how to improve the system. And you're also setting specific, measurable goals for the testing process itself. What are you trying to achieve with this round of testing? What are the targets you're aiming for?
So it's about finding the problems and figuring out the solutions and setting some concrete goals for the whole thing. And then we move on to the integration phase. What happens there?
Integration is all about sharing your findings with everyone who needs to know. You're getting buy-in on the results, making sure everyone agrees on what you found, and then you're setting functional goals based on what you've learned from the benchmarks. What level of performance are you shooting for? What does success look like?
Sounds like a lot of collaboration, getting everyone aligned.
Right. And then finally, you have the action phase. This is where the rubber meets the road. You're actually implementing changes based on what you've learned.
So this is where the real work begins.
Exactly. In the action phase, you create detailed test plans and documentation based on everything you've gathered in the previous phases. You actually implement the fixes you've identified, and you track the progress of those changes. And crucially, you shift from thinking about benchmark testing as a one-time thing to an ongoing process. It's about constantly monitoring and improving performance.
It's like a continuous feedback loop, right?
Right. Because systems are always evolving, you need to stay on top of things. Now, your sources also talk about these 3 core components of benchmark testing: workload specifications, metrics, and measurement. What are those all
I'd
about?
break those down.
Okay, so workload specifications are basically defining what kind of demands you're going to put on the system and how often those demands are going to happen. Like, are you trying to simulate a bunch of users all hitting the site at the same time? Or a steady flow of transactions? The workload needs to reflect how the application is actually being used in the real world.
So it's about realism, right? Making the test as close to the real thing as possible.
Exactly. Then you have metrics, which are basically just choosing what you're going to measure. We talked about some of those before, right? Like download speed, response time, CPU usage, error rates, anything you can measure that tells you something about how the system is performing.
And then there's measurement itself, which I guess is about how you actually collect the data for those metrics. Like, what tools do you use and how do you make sure you're getting accurate readings?
Precisely. It's about the nuts and bolts of data collection, making sure your measurements are trustworthy.
Okay. So to do all this effectively, there are some things you really need to keep in mind, right? Your sources stress the importance of consistency and control during the testing process.
Oh, yeah. Consistency is huge.
Yeah.
You need to make sure your testing environment is as consistent as possible so you can be confident that the results you're getting are actually meaningful. And you need to control for all the variables that could skew your results, like network conditions or other programs running in the background.
Right. You want to isolate the thing you're testing as much as possible.
Exactly. And then another thing that's really important is understanding how the system is actually put together. You need to know how all the pieces fit together to design the right tests and to make sense of the data you're getting.
So you can't just go in blind. You need a solid grasp of the architecture.
Exactly. You need to know what you're looking at. And your sources also mention the importance of looking at the initial data in the system and adjusting it based on the number of users you're simulating. What's the thinking behind that?
Yeah. I was curious about that too.
Well, a lot of systems have some baseline data that's already there even before users start interacting with it. And as the number of users grows, that data can change. So you need to account for those changes in your tests to make sure they're reflecting the real world.
Right. You need to keep things realistic. And they also make a point about checking for reset functionality and setting specific transaction rates, especially when you're testing databases. Why is that important?
So in systems that rely heavily on databases, it's super important to be able to reset the database to a clean slate before each test run. That way you're starting fresh each time, and you can be more confident that your results are repeatable. And defining how many transactions you expect to happen per second lets you measure how much the system can handle and helps you identify any bottlenecks.
Bottlenecks, like where things start to slow down because the system is overloaded.
Exactly. And another thing they suggest is breaking down the system into its separate functional parts for testing. Why do you think that is?
I guess it's like dividing and conquering, right? It's easier to pinpoint problems if you're testing smaller pieces of the system.
That's exactly it. By testing things piece by piece, you can zero in on exactly where the performance issues are coming from.
Right.
It makes the analysis much more targeted and efficient.
He's like a detective investigating a crime, right? You got to look at all the pieces of the puzzle.
That's a great analogy.
And,
And then another important point is that every system is going to be structured differently. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to benchmark testing.
so you got to adapt your approach to the specific system you're working with.
Exactly. The design and the components of the system are going to dictate how you design and run your tests. Your sources even provide this helpful checklist of things to verify before you start testing, like making sure all the software is working correctly, double-checking the operating system and drivers, deleting any temporary files, closing any unnecessary programs, and checking for OS updates. It's all about making sure your testing environment is clean and as close to the real world as possible.
Like tidying up your lab before you start an experiment, right? You want everything to be just so. And speaking of tools, your sources introduce this idea of benchmark testing frameworks. What are those all about?
So these frameworks are basically pre-built collections of tools and functions that are designed to do common performance checks. Things like testing how fast your database is, how efficiently your server is putting together web pages, how fast it's handling data in JSON format, and how quickly it's loading configuration settings. They're like a foundation you can build your specific tests on top of.
So it's like a toolbox full of pre-made gadgets you can use to build your own custom testing contraption.
That's a great way to put it. And your sources mention Benchmark Framework 2.0 and Tech Empower as examples. Tech Empower seems to get a little more attention, anything special about it.
Yeah. What makes it stand out?
Well, Tech Empower is open source, which is always a plus. And one of the big things about it is that it forces you to set up your testing environment correctly, which helps make sure that everyone's tests are being run under the same conditions. It also has these two main modes: benchmark mode, which is for comparing how different technologies or frameworks stack up against each other, and verify mode, which is meant for people who maybe aren't experts but still need to do some basic performance testing.
So it's user-friendly for different skill levels. That's cool.
Right. And it uses these unique files that are specific to the system you're testing. It also has this thing called a benchmark config file, which is basically a set of instructions and info about each benchmark program. And it works with a bunch of different programming languages, which is great. And for tests that involve databases, it often uses these things called object relational mappers, or ORMs, which basically act as a translator between your code and the database, which makes things easier.
Sounds pretty comprehensive. So it's like a Swiss Army knife for benchmark testing.
Pretty much. And then beyond these frameworks, there's also a whole bunch of specific benchmark testing tools out there. The sources list a bunch of them and they categorize them based on what they're meant to test. You want to run through some of those?
Yeah. Let's see what's out there.
So for general PC performance on Windows, they mention tools like Prime95, Nova Bench, 3D Mark, and Psi Software Sandra. And if you're specifically interested in how your CPU is performing, there's Cinebench and Geekbench.
That's the popular ones, right?
Yeah, they are. And what about if you want to check the overall speed of your system or the battery life on your mobile device?
Yeah. What tools are good for that?
So for Linux systems, there's Phoronix. For CPU testing in general, there's CPU User Benchmark. And for testing how well web browsers are performing on mobile devices, there's Volamo. And then there's Passmark, which is a good one for testing Android phones and tablets.
So there's a tool for pretty much everything.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
So to wrap up, what are the big takeaways about benchmark testing from all this information?
Yeah, let's summarize what we've learned.
Okay, so the main point is that benchmark testing gives you this really solid way to figure out how well all sorts of systems are performing software, hardware, even business processes. It helps you understand how a system holds up under pressure, like when it's getting bombarded with requests, which can happen during a cyber attack. And there are three main things to remember: workload specifications, which is about defining what you're going to throw at the system; metrics, which is choosing what you're going to measure; and measurement itself, which is about how you collect that data. And of course, there are tons of tools and frameworks out there to help you do all this efficiently. And all these principles apply to mobile devices too.
Yeah, it's been a really deep dive, and it's clear that benchmark testing is about way more than just running a speed test. It's this structured process for understanding and improving performance across a huge range of areas. So here's a thought for you, our listener. Given how much emphasis there is in benchmark testing on getting these hard numbers, what are some of the things it might miss? Like, are there aspects of performance or quality that are harder to measure? And how would you go about capturing those things to get a truly complete picture? And think about how this idea of setting benchmarks, creating these clear standards for comparison might be useful in your own work or in areas you're interested in, even if it's not directly related to software or hardware. It's really about having a reliable way to gauge progress and success, whatever you're doing.
It's about setting the bar, right?
Yeah.
Defining what good looks like, and then constantly striving to clear it.
Exactly. And that's applicable to just about anything.